think we're ready to begin. I guess it's a really tough morning to get a lot of people out right now. Physical mobility is down with the rain, but I'm sure people will trickle in. So good morning and welcome to AEI. My name is Aparna Mathur and I'm a resident scholar in economic policy studies here at AEI, working on issues of economic mobility, labor markets, and taxes. And today we're here to discuss a new report on global economic mobility that has been issued by a research team at the World Bank. We're very fortunate to have Ambar Narayan here, who was one of the lead authors on the report. And the report is fairly remarkable in that it covers 96% of the world's population, almost 148 countries, and gives us a pretty comprehensive look at global economic mobility. How are people doing around the globe? Are children, doing better than their parents in terms of mobility? Are they moving up? And what I like about the report is also sort of a focus on a new metric of mobility, which is educational mobility. We've traditionally looked at economic mobility in terms of incomes. We had a really interesting report out by Raj Chetty and his team. They've done a series of reports over the past few years looking at economic mobility in terms of how children are doing, are they earning better than their parents? And what the World Bank report does is it asks the question, are children learning better than their parents or out-learning their parents in terms of educational outcomes? So just to sort of get us started, I had started looking at comparing the Chetty data with the World Bank data, and this is specific to the US. And I know Ambar is hesitant to focus in on any one country. The World Bank is looking at, as I said, more than 140 countries around the globe, and sort of fixating on any one country is doesn't give you the full picture. But I was just trying to do this for the US, and what you find, so this is a chart showing you what percent of children out-earn their parents in the US. This is from the Raj Chetty data set. And what we find from the World Bank report is a trend that looks very similar in terms of children out-learning their parents. And you see, again, for each birth cohort, starting from the 1940s to the 1950s, 1980s, the trend has been declining. So fewer and fewer percentage of children are out learning or earning higher educational credentials than their parents. So I'm very interested to hear how our panelists view the findings from the report, where we see areas of optimism and pessimism, and how we can help improve mobility, not just for people in the US, but across the globe. In terms of format, we will first have Ambar present the main findings from the report for about 15 minutes, and then turn to our panelists for discussion and Q&A, and then turn to our audience. Let me do a quick round of introduction of our panelists. Ambar Narayan is the lead economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank, where he leads and advises teams conducting policy analysis, evaluations, and research and development from a microeconomic perspective. Topics they cover include inequality of opportunity, economic mobility, policy evaluation, structural and spatial transformation, and the welfare impacts of economic shocks. Eric Hanushek is the John H. Macon Visiting Scholar at AEI. He is currently also the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is a leader in developing economic analysis of educational issues, and he has authored numerous studies on class size reduction, high-stakes accountability, the assessment of teacher quality, and other education-related topics. John MacArthur is an economist focused on the sustainable improvement of living standards around the world. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a senior advisor to the UN Foundation, and a board governor of Canada's International Development Research Centre. Previously, he served as manager and deputy director of the UN Millennium Project. And finally, Scott Winship directs the Social Capital Project for the Joint Economic Committee Vice Chairman Mike Lee. Previously, he conducted research on living standards, poverty, inequality, unemployment, and economic mobility at the Manhattan Institute, where he was the Walter B. Wriston Fellow, and he was also at the Brookings Institution. So I'm going to welcome all our panelists and get started.
I can stand there.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. You want me to go there?
Yeah.
I think I have this. Okay. So you
I
can,
think this is for the...
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me make sure I can. So, feel free to give me a time warning,
Okay.
not 2 minutes to go or whatever. Thank you very much, Aparna, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to present this report. So the report is first of all, I just want to. There's a whole team is mentioned there, and it's a team effort, as you can see. There's an enormous effort in actually putting together the data set, which has made this report possible. So the report is about intergenerational mobility, which we see as a key element of human progress. And this is particularly true when mobility is seen in both absolute and relative terms. And I'm going to keep switching back and forth between these two different concepts when I'm presenting the results. So absolute mobility is about whether individuals are better off than their parents. And as Aparna has mentioned, this report really takes a close look at the educational attainment of children relative to their parents. And relative mobility is about how closely an individual's position on the economic ladder is tied to their parents' position. So obviously, absolute mobility is it's about growth, it's about economic progress, and it's also about how economic progress reaches the different parts of the population, because if economic progress benefits a larger share of the population, absolute mobility is going to be higher. And relative mobility is about fairness. It's about equal chance of succeeding in life regardless of the circumstances that you're born in. So this is just a little illustration, the sort of explaining these concepts. And essentially, absolute upward mobility is like going up an escalator where everybody is on the same step as before, but the whole staircase goes up. So that's upward mobility. Relative mobility is about changes in position. So your position as an offspring on the economic ladder is not tied to your parents' position, and so on. And one thing I wanted to point out, looking at this little picture, is that in the second picture, in the lower panel, what you can see is that this is a society with perfect relative mobility, but half of the society is not doing better than before. And this is to make the point that to sustain a social contract, you need both types of mobility. You want fairness in the sense that your position on the economic ladder should not be influenced entirely by your parents' position, but you also want society to move up the economic ladder. So that's why we need both. So it's about meeting the aspiration, the universal aspiration of parents, hoping for a better life for their children, and it's about fairness, about children having equal opportunities to succeed in life. So this study, why this study? Why did we undertake this enormous effort to put together data and measure mobility across the world? And that's because there's a very large evidence gap in intergenerational mobility. The largest pre-existing study actually covers no more than 42 countries, and this is for income mobility as well as education mobility. And just a few of those are developing countries. We focus primarily on educational mobility, firstly because it is an essential element of economic mobility and economic well-being in its own right. There is also global coverage of data on educational attainment, not so much on quality, which is why our measure does not include education quality, which is an important limitation of the measures that we use. And it's also educational mobility is also strongly associated with income mobility, with a correlation about 0.5, which is pretty strong. But when we look at the limitations of measuring mobility in terms of primarily education mobility, obviously, as I mentioned, we don't adjust for the quality of education. We just look at years of education. And secondly, as I'm going to talk about a little bit and show some results, economic mobility obviously depends on a bunch of other factors which go beyond educational mobility. And this is particularly true for high-income countries where a large share of the population have attained a certain levels of education, at least in terms of years of education. So our global database, as Aparna had mentioned, covers about 96% of the world population, 148 countries or economies, out of which 111 are developing economies, and for 111, we have estimates for multiple cohorts. And we also complement these with income mobility estimates, which are combined, which are a combination of our own estimates and comparable estimates from different studies for 75 economies. So even the income database is fairly large. So these are the measures. I'm not going to spend much time on it. I can take more questions. Absolute mobility is defined in very simple terms, sort of mimicking what Chetty and others did in the income space. It's simply the share of a particular generation or the proportion of a particular generation who have more years of schooling than their parents. Relative mobility is defined or measured in terms of two different measures. One is to do with persistence measured by a regression coefficient of offspring education on parental education. So higher that regression coefficient, greater is the persistence, lower is the relative mobility. And for robustness, we also use another measure, which is just the correlation coefficient between parental schooling, parental years of education, and the offspring's years of education. We also have certain transition matrix-based measures, which are a hybrid of absolute and relative mobility, if you will. And the one that I'm going to particularly focus on a little bit and show some results is the one what we call as poverty to privilege, which is the share of children whose parents are in the bottom half of the education distribution who make it to the top quartile of the education distribution in their generation. So that's an upward mobility measure, but it's also relative mobility, so it's a hybrid between the two. All the averages that I'm going to show are unweighted by population, which means they don't represent a representative individual for that group of countries. It's just a simple average across countries where every country counts the same way. So this is the first graph that I'm going to show. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that, so the bars here show relative mobility. Okay? So the bars here actually show persistence, which means the greater the height of the bar, lower is relative mobility. So for all measures of relative mobility, you have to read it in reverse. Lower persistence means higher mobility. And for absolute mobility, of course, higher is better. So the bars here indicate relative mobility or persistence, and the dots indicate absolute mobility. And you can see that there's a large gap between the average for developing countries and the average for high-income countries. And then we've split up the developing countries in terms of the regions the way we define in the World Bank, so which are Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, East Asia and Pacific. There's a certain way the World Bank divides it, which is not entirely completely intuitive, but it more or less maps to the geographic regions of the world, Middle East and North Africa and Latin America. And what you can see is that if you sort them in terms of relative mobility, you can see how they're ranked. East Asia Pacific does the best in terms of relative mobility, and relative mobility is particularly low, and absolute mobility, both are particularly low in the poorest regions of the world, which are Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Few numbers here. The 15 economies with the lowest relative mobility are all developing economies. If you look at absolute mobility, 47% of the 80s generation, which is the latest generation of adults in our study, because these are the latest generation who would have certainly finished their education. So 47% of that generation are more educated than their parents in the average developing economy, and the same number is almost 60% or 57% in the average high-income economy. So this is a map of relative and absolute mobility across the world. And what you can see is that, of course, there's a clear pattern of mobility, both absolute and relative, being higher in the high-income regions, which are essentially parts of East Asia, North America, parts of North America, or most of North America, and Europe. But there's also a lot of variation within the developing world, particularly in absolute mobility. And just one number here, absolute mobility in some of the poorest countries in Sub-Saharan Africa is 12%. So just 12% of the latest generation of adults are more educated than their parents. In parts of East Asia, it's more than 80%. And this is the range of variation in the developing world. And 13 of the bottom 15 economies by either mobility, absolute or relative, among the young adults, those born in the 1980s, are in Africa and South Asia. So it's just to illustrate the extent of variation that you see even within the developing world. We look at the correlation between absolute and relative mobility because, as I mentioned, I think we make a point in the report that both are important. So how are they correlated? So in general, what you find is that economies with higher absolute mobility, on the average, tend to have higher relative mobility. And this is and all this is for education, which kind of makes sense. If you're investing in education, if your generations are getting more educated, it's probably likely that there is some equalization of opportunity where your birth circumstances matter less and so on. But the correlation is far from perfect. and it's about 0.35, so which is not perfect at all. And I would like you to focus on the outliers here. So if you look at the outliers, and I'll just name 3: Lesotho, South Sudan, Guinea. These are countries with apparently high relative mobility in education. But look at their absolute mobility, which tends to be extremely low. And this is just to illustrate the point that both types of mobility matters. In particular, in countries where absolute mobility is low, having low relative mobility is actually, it's not very meaningful to look at their relative mobility. Because these are cases, I mean, think of a case where education levels are very low. Very few people are getting educated. And parental education is also low. Now, both these things could be randomly distributed. Maybe your parents' education doesn't matter at all, but very few people are getting educated. So the apparently high relative mobility in such a society is not something that is a positive at all. So this is clearly high relative mobility has little meaning in the absence of absolute mobility. That's the point we wanted to make in this slide. So what are the time trends? Now, over time, this is on relative mobility, and the graph here shows the regression coefficient and the correlation coefficient. And we show both, even though in the report we focus more on the regression coefficient, but it's important to show both just to see how the measures might affect the time trends. And the basic takeaway from this slide is that over time, the gap between developing economies and high-income economies in relative mobility has increased. Again, a higher line means more persistence, means lower relative mobility. Okay, so in relative mobility, it's always in the reverse direction. So you can see that developing countries have always been less mobile in terms of relative mobility than the high-income world, and the gap has actually increased. There has been improvement in high-income countries over time, not so for developing economies since the 1960s. The average relative mobility in developing economies has not improved since the 1960s, and the developing economy average for the 80s generation is actually close to the high-income average for the 40s generation. So there's almost a 40-year time gap if you are to believe that over time relative mobility increases. Looking at absolute mobility, it's actually quite interesting. Now, absolute mobility in education, this is not true for income, so let me just say this is true for education. Now, remember, education is bounded from above. You can't, the way we measure education, you can't exceed a certain level of education. So over time, as a greater share of a generation gets educated, you have more and more educated parents. So you would expect that over time, as education levels increase, absolute mobility level, the absolute mobility rate of a country is likely to come down. Just because there's it's just harder to exceed the education level of your parents. And that's what we see for the high-income economies. There's an interesting gender difference there, which I'm going to mention later on, but you can see that for women in high-income countries, actually absolute mobility has exceeded that of men beyond the 1960s. But in general, if you take women and men together in high-income countries, absolute mobility rates have started declining. And that, as I mentioned, is partly and almost entirely due to the effect of, once you have a certain level of education, it's hard to exceed that in the next generation. But look at the developing world. Even in the developing world, absolute mobility has stopped increasing since the 1960s. And this has happened at a much lower level, average level of education. In fact, the average tertiary attainment in developing economies today is similar to the high-income average 40 years ago, which means that we cannot claim that the developing countries have hit that ceiling because the ceiling is very far away. And even then, the absolute mobility trends are stagnant. They're flat. But again, there is this pattern of the gender gap closing. In the next slide, we look at this a little bit more in detail. And this is not in the report, but we've just done this work, and there's a recent blog. So I just want to mention it a little bit, which is that this effect that we spoke about, that I just talked about, this would mean that if you look at a particular country, a particular set of countries, what you should find is what you see here for the high-income countries over here, which is that higher the parental education, level of parental education or educational attainment, your absolute mobility should be coming down. Okay, so this basically is what is happening for the high-income countries. So one would expect absolute mobility to decline as parental education rises, which is what happens for high-income countries. But if you look at the developing regions, and we have the 6 regions over here, you see a different pattern, particularly for the poorer developing regions like Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and so on, which is that you see an inverted U shape, which means that at very low levels of parental education, as parental education increases, absolute mobility actually increases. So what is happening here is that even though it's a situation where higher parental education makes it hard to be more absolutely mobile. That effect is there, but that is being swamped by some other effect, which is to do with something like a poverty trap, which is that your parents have very low education. It's relatively easy, quote unquote, to exceed your parents' education. But in a developing country and a really poor region like the sub-Saharan Africa and even in some of the other regions in the past, you see this inverted U shape, which is consistent with this idea of a poverty trap if you were to believe that incomes are strongly correlated with education and so on. The good thing is that the poverty trap is weaker for the richer developing region. So that's an interesting pattern. And you also see that over time, because we've done it for different cohorts, and as the colors become darker, we are talking about more and more recent cohorts. So over time, that inverted hockey stick is kind of flattening out, which means the poverty traps seem to be weakening over time, even in the poor regions. But the basic point we want to make here is that in developing economies, absolute mobility is limited by low upward mobility among those born to parents with lower levels of education. So the so-called ceiling effect of education is not the driving factor at all in developing countries for the stagnation in absolute mobility. So this is the transition measure, the matrix measure that I was talking about, poverty to privilege. And when we look at this, what we find is that almost everywhere those born into the bottom half by parental education have a low chance of rising to the top quartile. In a perfect world, this would be 25%. Actually, it rarely exceeds 20%. In Denmark, it's somewhere close to 20%. Importantly, 46 of the bottom 50 by this measure, and the countries are all ranked here for the 1980s cohort. So 46 of the bottom 50 by upward mobility from the lower half are developing economies. For the median developing economy, more than 2/3 of those born in the lower half stay in the lower half. And this is a rate which is also, it's fallen slightly for the developing world over time. For the high-income world, it has, there's been a little bit of increase, but basically worldwide, this upward mobility from the bottom has been pretty much flat from the 40s till the 80s generation. So it's been more or less, all doom and gloom so far, and that's probably because I have focused more on the sort of the negative part of the message. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, the fact that it's not all gloomy. So first of all, what we do find is that changing the status quo, the status quo is possible with policy action. And we find rapid rise in educational mobility, absolute as well as relative, in parts of the developing world. For example, East Asia, Latin America, and even the Middle East from the 1950s to the 1980s generation. And of course, in the high-income countries, if you look at the period from the 40s till the 80s, remember, we are defining high income in terms of high income today. So some of these countries were not high income. Korea wasn't high income in the 1940s, and even parts of Western Europe, like Portugal and Spain and so on. So there is a positive message that you can improve educational mobility, and you see tremendous improvements in some of these countries. So that's a very important positive message for both absolute and relative. In Africa and South Asia, remember that our estimates stop at people who were born in the 1980s and who were educated in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Of course, things have happened since then. The Millennium Development Goals and increasing investment in education and so on. So what you find is rising enrollments. We do some projections, and we find that you can expect absolute mobility to actually increase in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia when the children who are born after the 1980s, when they would complete their education and so on. Not so much relative mobility, but at least on absolute mobility, the outlook seems to be more positive than what we've seen over the last 40 years. And as I mentioned, worldwide, girls are catching up with boys in educational mobility. There's actually a reverse gender gap in tertiary education and absolute education mobility in the high-income world. So it's a different sort of a problem. In fact, today, for the 1980s generation, a girl is born in a high-income country is more likely to exceed the education of both her parents compared to a boy. That's basically where we are now. In the developing country, I think the trends are moving. In the developing world, the trends are moving in the same direction. Of course, there's a huge variation across countries. This is not true for India, for example, or Nigeria, but it's true for large parts of the developing world. I didn't want to spend much time on a particular country, but I thought that since I'm presenting in the United States, just worth presenting a little bit of what we find for the United States in this database. And what you find is that, what I take away from this is, and here we are comparing the United States with a high-income average. Okay, so we have 37 high-income countries. We're comparing with the high-income average, simple average, not population-weighted. Every country counts the same. So in the United States, relative mobility in education has improved, I think, pretty dramatically over time, but with declining absolute mobility. And the decline in absolute mobility is something that we find in the high-income world in general for the reasons that I mentioned before. But in the US, the decline also means that the gap with the high-income, with the average for the high-income countries had not really closed over time. In relative mobility, the gap has converged. It has closed over time, and there are improvements. In terms of the poverty to privilege rate, I think in the United States, it has been pretty stagnant since the 1960s, since the decade of the 1960s. Just very quickly, what we find in relative mobility in income, and here is how income mobility, relative mobility looks across the world. And here's what the world looks like, the 75 economies for which we have these estimates, if you rank them in terms of relative mobility of income. Very similar patterns on the whole. Very similar to what you see for education mobility, which is that you find low-income mobility in the developing world. The developing world is less mobile in terms of income mobility, just like it is in terms of education mobility. Parts of South Asia, the Middle East, actually stands out as a region with extremely low relative income mobility. And Latin America, 24 of the bottom 25 countries out of the 75 by relative income mobility are actually developing countries. It's interesting to see how these measures are actually correlated. Now, if you think of income mobility and education mobility, there is of course an imperfect correlation, and the graph on the top panel it shows you the extent of correlation. It's about 0.5, as I mentioned before. Now, this relationship essentially depends on two things, roughly speaking: how similar the countries are in terms of returns to education, and how similar the countries are in terms of how education predicts income. And what we find is that there is actually a big difference between the developing world as a whole and the high-income world. And the second graph actually shows that. What it shows is that education and income mobility are much more closely correlated or closely associated in the developing world compared to the high-income countries. And there's a good intuitive reason for that, which is that as countries develop, as more and more people get educated, what matters more are A, the quality of education, the factor markets, including the labor market, policies that affect the labor market, as well as safety nets and other things. So things other than education start mattering more, and that's the pattern that we see. It's interesting to note that there are parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, examples being Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Uganda, Colombia, so there are some Latin American countries as well, where education mobility is or rather income mobility is much lower than what would be predicted given the cross-country relationship between education and income mobility, which means that they're just much more, so labor markets essentially perhaps don't function as well. So in spite of relatively high educational mobility and progress in education mobility, Egypt, Tunisia, and others seem to be really falling behind in income mobility. So I'm just going to end by not just going to the last slide and giving you the main messages of the study. And the other slides are also there if there are questions that come up, and I can respond to some of them. But to conclude, here are the main points I wanted to mention. So first of all, as I started by saying, which is that I think the report makes the point that intergenerational mobility, both absolute and relative, addresses the basic human aspirations of progress, economic progress on the one hand, and fairness on the other. And raising mobility, the report shows, is likely to create a virtuous cycle, which means it is likely to break the inequality trap. So in a country with a very high levels of inequality, you're likely to have high degree of inequality of opportunity, which in turn reduces mobility, and over generations, it perpetuates the inequality trap. So it just seems to make sense that one would want to intervene, particularly in reducing this inequality of opportunities. And we also claim, and there is theoretical and some empirical literature to suggest that even growth in the long term will be promoted by raising mobility, because a more mobile society is one where talent and effort are rewarded as opposed to privilege and where you are born. So it's just a more efficient allocation of resources. The average developing economy, in the average developing economy, progress has stalled since the 1960s, and they're still much less mobile than the average high-income economy. So mobility is not just a concern for the high-income world, even though we hear a lot about it in the context of developed economies. It's an even more of a concern in the developing world. For raising both types of mobility, economic growth must be complemented by policies to reduce inequality of opportunities at different stages of life. And I didn't go over the details, but what we find is that controlling for the level of income, the amount of investment that is made in public education, for example, has a strong relationship with education mobility. So it's not just about growth, it's also about investing in the right sorts of things. And the kind of things that we talk about in the report are essentially pro-poor policies backed by resources that are adequate and spent wisely. So building the ladders to opportunities must start early in the lives of children, starting with maternal health and reducing opportunity gaps in education, early childhood interventions. It also involves expanding and equalizing economic opportunities, because educational mobility is not the only thing that matters for income mobility. And at the end of the day, if you're concerned about income mobility, it's also about equalizing opportunities in well-functioning labor markets. Localizing policies and investments to equalize opportunities across space, because what we find is that the spatial inequality of opportunity, so inequality of opportunity across space, seems to have a strong relationship with the extent of mobility you have in a country. These are all correlations, because that's all we can do with a global database, but they're consistent with evidence that Chetty and others have found for the United States and some evidence in other countries as well. And finally, fiscal policy, because you need resources to help equalize opportunities. You also need a fiscal policy which is at least effective in reducing extreme inequalities and wealth and so on. Because one of the things that we must remember, that equalizing opportunities is not just about providing universal care to a basic to a basic standard of education health, but it's also about moderating extreme differences in the circumstances themselves. So on that note, I would say thank you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Amber. We're now going to turn to Eric. And if you want to sit, Eric, that's fine. If you want to do slides.
I'm pleased to be here. This is an amazing report. I've been looking at international data for some time recently, and in the international world, you're always looking for a consistent data set that ranks and compares different countries, and that's what they have produced in an amazing resource. What I want to talk about and put in a larger focus, we in the international world know about the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN passed in 2015 that said by 2030 there was a very ambitious set of things that were going to be accomplished. That included eliminating poverty, it included no hunger in the world, everybody has good health, and so forth. Now, the way I look at this report in some ways is that the intergenerational mobility is really the dynamics behind this development story. So if I looked at this, that the IGMs, you get no poverty by having large absolute mobility, so that the kids in poverty grow up out of poverty. You eliminate hunger by the same kind of things, where families are developing and the society is developing. You take care of health in the same way. And as I counted up, the only thing I would exclude is the environmental components of these 17 goals, but you get roughly 10 of these goals that are directly related to the intergenerational mobility, particularly the absolute, but also the relative mobility. Now, out of the 17 goals, it's clear that economic growth drives all 17 in many ways, that you cannot have reached the goals of no poverty and health, or even sustainable environments, without having more resources. You can't just redistribute your way to all those goals. And in the things that I've been doing recently, it suggests that the only way to get economic growth is to have high quality education. So these are stories that fit in directly with the report, maybe a little bit more succinctly than 500 pages, but it falls directly in line. Now the problem I have, though, is that when I thought about this, we have some problems of linking education to economic growth. And it comes around to measuring human capital, or what we've called the knowledge capital of nations. The story that you get, this is the simple growth story that it lies behind this report. Now what I've done here is plot on the horizontal axis conditional years of schooling, I'll explain conditional in a second, against conditional growth rates. And these are all countries scattered up, and you see that more schooling equals more growth. Now conditional just means that you take into account the starting point of countries. These are long-term growth rates, by the way, between 1960 and 2000 across countries. And if you take into account the early income levels, it's natural, because if you start behind, it's easier to grow fast. All you have to do is copy what everybody else is doing. If you start ahead, you have to actually invent things, and that's harder. But once you take that into account, you get this positive relationship between them. The only other thing that I should tell you about this picture is that it's entirely wrong. It's entirely wrong because if we, you can see part of it that links to some of the things that came out of the report recently. If I identify East Asian countries, what we see is that we have the East Asian miracle, where they're all having much higher growth than you would expect based upon their schooling levels. And on the other side, you see the Latin America growth puzzle, where all the Latin American countries are at the bottom. Now this corresponds to the statement that Latin America income mobility is much lower than you'd expect given their education mobility. And what's behind this? Well, what's behind this is that years of schooling is just a very bad measure of the skills of people, particularly in an international comparative way. Here's what I would call the right picture. If we take all of our information on test scores around the world, we've been testing kids around the world since 1960s, and you take a math problem, you march it around the world, and you see how many can solve it, and you get a measure of how much kids are learning per year of schooling. This just takes for all the countries that we can do it and puts together all of the measures of math and science scores for countries. And what you see here is, first, all the countries are much closer to this line that relates cognitive skills, math and science, or knowledge capital to growth rates. What you also know that I won't go into today is that this is a very steep line. Countries where people know more, in fact, grow a lot faster. Now, let me come back to the report. Here's the picture I showed you before about years of schooling and growth rates, this positive relationship. Once I take into account what kids know, you get a perfectly flat line. Years of schooling is unrelated to economic growth once you take into account what they learned. Now, this is exactly the story of the Millennium Development Goals, where in fact we induced a lot of countries to keep kids in school, but then we found out that they weren't learning anything. So we increased years of schooling without increasing any knowledge, and in simplest terms, what this says is if you go to school and don't learn anything, it doesn't count. So that's the problem that I think that is the next iteration of intergenerational mobility measures in thinking about this, that somehow quality has to be put into this, because that's how you get these regions of the countries that are where income mobility is much less than you expect given educational mobility. It's the Latin American countries where they go to school and they don't learn anything. There are other countries, other parts of the world that are the same. So the second issue that I would like to bring up that I had a little bit of difficulty with in the report was the issue of causation. The simple question is, if you tend to improve intergenerational mobility, do you think growth will improve? And that's hinted at throughout the book. As far as I can tell, the evidence is rather thin to suggest that, in fact, more income mobility or more education mobility will, in fact, improve growth by itself. I can see the causation going the other way, that higher growth, giving you more resources, in fact, tends to be a necessary condition, at least, for absolute intergenerational mobility. But I have trouble seeing that causation runs in that direction. And then let me quickly come back to what was talked about at the end of policy alternatives. And this is where I'm a little bit concerned about the report, is that we have call up into play a bunch of things that we've always wanted to do that aren't quite linked to the evidence. So in the policy alternatives, the two that seem to stand out are improving the quality of schooling through preschool education or expanded quality of education. Now, in the report, they lump together, because they don't measure quality of education throughout the report, they lump together access and quality. We had to do both. Well, that's exactly what we did with the Millennium Development Goals. That's exactly what we've done with a number of conditional cash transfer programs, where we have, in fact, managed to increase the amount of seat time in schools without increasing the amount of learning that goes on. And so I would, in taking these policy alternatives, emphasize quality over access, because that's the only way that these countries are going to improve. Now, I'll just mention after that, there's also this long list of things that look like policies that we might want to have: more progressive income taxation, more active labor market policies, more efficient markets, which means more regulatory conditions. And I'm less convinced that that's the way that developing countries are either going to improve their economies or improve their intergenerational mobility. So let me give a few concluding remarks quickly. I think that this report highlights what is absolutely true, that more intergenerational mobility is essential to the development process. And if you don't have that, development won't really happen, or in the way we want. Nobody really wants to develop more strong men in Africa who rape their countries. It's the fact that we want to, in fact, improve the quality of schooling and incomes for populations as opposed to one or two strong men. This is, I think, a magnificent project, because it starts to put together a data set that is really going to be very, very useful and spur a lot of research. As this gets out into the world, I think that people will gravitate to it quite a bit. But I think that this report is more in terms of motivational than actually giving policy alternatives. I think it's a little bit premature to take this report and start talking about policies out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Great. Well, we've covered such a waterfront already of topics, and thank you, Aparna and Amar and Eric and Scott. It's a treat. And it's funny because so many of the comments that have been made already provide context for some of the thoughts I had. And I would just say that first to celebrate this monumental piece of work. It's an enormous contribution. And I think the first thing that we all just need to have clarity in our heads around, and it goes back to what Eric just said, is what's the nature of the contribution? And in my view, this database, the global data set on intergenerational mobility, is the core contribution. And it's an extraordinary amount of work. And reports, and I say that because reports like this so often are the culmination or the conclusion of a massive effort. I feel like this is the start of an even more massive effort. And there are a lot of researchers I know who are quite excited to dive into this because of what it allows us to start to consider. Another thing I think is very important, and the report is very explicit on all these things, so I'm not critiquing it, I'm just kind of fleshing it out, just to be clear, is it takes us up to a certain point in time. So it really takes us up to 1989 as the final year of birth cohorts with a little bit of information about the 1990s. So really, a person who's 29 years old today would be the youngest person included in this report. That's important because so much of the story that Eric was just referencing around the Millennium Development Goal era is really kids who were born in the 1990s, even the mid-1990s or 2000s. So that matters because I think there are a lot of puzzles there, and I would agree with the contours very much, having worked on the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals on those issues. The contours are very much there, but I would say even there are a lot of things to which we need much better answers, much more country-by-country precision to understand these dynamics. And we can all have our policy debates on the therefores and what we learn from each instance. But I think this database provides an extraordinary opportunity to start diving into those questions in a way we haven't done before. And I hope it will only continue to be updated as these new cohorts might have relevant information available. I say that because also, even when we look at some of the data that Eric was just referencing, I think a lot of the low-income countries are undersampled. And so we don't have so much information on sub-Saharan Africa in particular. I saw Mozambique was in that slide, but this is just a general problem. So often in these global data sets, people reference Africa because there's like 3 observations from Africa, and often it's Morocco or Tunisia or North Africa, or maybe it's South Africa. It's not so many of the, I would say, the frontier issues on the lowest dimensions of the human capital measurement challenge, where there's huge undersampling problems. And then, of course, in South Asia, where the complexities of extraordinarily large populations of sampling and the diversity of, we don't even have good sense of how to measure poverty in India. Still, it's a massive debate. So just to be clear on how the frontier is evolving. That said, I did just want to flesh out, I think, why some numbers for why these questions are important. Because with absolute underscoring of the caveat on the enrollment problem, if you will, I don't think it's a negative that there was a boost on enrollment, but it was certainly not sufficient to boost kids in school. And there are multiple channels through which making sure kids are in school can help society. The coefficient on years of schooling towards skill level is certainly way too low. But there are effects on everything from keeping girls in school, has a dramatic effect on voluntary declines in fertility, can have often effects on other aspects of social change. And we saw a lot of health information, for example, disseminated through a lot of educational programs, which is crucial in what was arguably the biggest transformation in global policy in the past 20 years, which is in health outcomes. We don't have so much information on intergenerational mobility and health outcomes, which is arguably where there would be the most interesting story to tell in the world. But we have a dramatic shift in terms of life expectancy, convergence in both relative and absolute outcomes in a lot of basic measures. So this is unprecedented in modern history in terms of how well the world has started to take on the basic measure of living standards, which is, do you get to live? And the most basic, perhaps. So all that said, I did a study recently where I just looked at what are the accelerations on enrollments and even gender parity of enrollments at the primary level, just to understand that, at least as a parameter for a proper dive. And we saw that in the low-income countries in particular, at least roughly three-quarters of country had at least 1 percentage point per year incremental acceleration of enrollments during the 2000s compared to the 1990s. So that would be probably the cohort born in the 1990s and the 2000s. That was in the low-income countries, but only half of the middle-income countries. We saw in gender parity index, about 2/3 of the countries in developing countries overall saw an acceleration of improvements for girls' enrollment compared to boys. So we saw a dramatic shift. We also saw that the average rate of improvement was about, again, 1 percentage point a year was the shift. So this was, on a cumulative basis, pretty big, but a gradual playing out across the country. So these are the types of things I think we all need to understand better exactly to get at the questions that Eric's rightly raising. And on average, this matters because the increment of kids from this global policy experiment, if you will, of pay attention to kids out of school, that was really what the experiment came down to, is pay attention to these kids who are out of school. It's on the order of 75 to 100 million more kids who graduated from primary school over this period. So it's a pretty significant number. Remember, our cohort is probably a ballpark about 120 million births a year. So this is, roughly speaking, a significant increment. But at the same time, I'm delighted the way Eric introduced the Sustainable Development Goals, because this is both not just an issue of developing countries. Every country in the world is grappling with these challenges of exclusion, mobility. The Chetty and colleagues' data, of course, brings attention to this. But it's, I would argue, about a couple of things. One is understanding that we just put out a preliminary assessment last week of how's the world doing en route to these 2030 trajectories. Right now, even today, on business as usual, you'll have about 6 million kids per year who don't finish primary school. So that's, it's a small percentage, it's single digits percentage, but it's still a significant number of kids around the world not even finishing primary school. Within that kind of generational transition, we have this early childhood development debate where a lot of countries are really emphasizing this now. There are people in this room who know vastly more about this topic than me, but we're on track for our estimate is about 46 million kids won't be in early childhood education pre-primary by then. So roughly half the world is not doing it, even with this transition happening. So is that a good or bad? How should we understand that? We can all have our views, but that's a debate that needs to be had. But I think the final bit I would just say is this: I've looked a lot, I'm Canadian, I've been looking a lot at the Canadian data on these questions lately. And even I'm going to, with trepidation, wade into the issue of test scores, because my home province of British Columbia does extremely well on the basic science test scores, for example. It's been an issue of public debate, public celebration. If you look across the country, quote unquote, even in Canada, we haven't been having an argument on minimum thresholds on these test scores, which is, I would argue, the debate for participation in the mobility opportunities. And this gets into the future of work and all these questions, but even in Canada, roughly 15 to 20% on the PISA and the PIAC scores are of children, adolescents, and even adults are kind of below minimum standards of numeracy and literacy, what I would argue are minimum standards. And so this gets into a very deep question of how we're thinking about, I would say, your entry ticket to the mobility question. And when we think about quintiles and averages and all this, we might actually be missing a key thread, and the foremost thread of the Sustainable Development Goal frame, which is no one left behind. And what does it mean for people to have access to the labor markets, the benefits of whatever policies a government might take on. And I think that we really need to be identifying that with some rigor in perhaps an economy-specific context, because it won't be the same in every place. But these are exactly the questions, again, coming back to this starting point, that I hope this data set can help us start to delve into with much more rigor moving forward. So kudos again to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna, and thanks for AEI to inviting me to speak on the panel. I want to start out by offering my acclaim as well to ANBAR. It really is just an incredible research effort, more ambitious than anything I think that's been undertaken before in cross-national mobility research. I also think there's just a number of important results that he's already identified. I agree with my panelists that this is sort of the beginning, and I think it'll be a good resource for people moving forward. But just the wide range of mobility outcomes across developing countries, the stronger trends for women than for men, and correlations between early indicators of unequal opportunity and mobility. I think just a very well done report. So I'm not a cross-national expert, so I'm going to use my time to make a couple tedious methodological and conceptual points, and if you're lucky, there'll be a third tedious point. So the first point I just want to make is I believe absolute mobility should be a secondary indicator rather than a primary one. And the way that I'm going to sort of illustrate this is to talk about income mobility. So the share of people with higher living standards than their parents is really ambiguous as an indicator of well-being. For starters, absolute mobility rates can be high without living standards being high. And they can be low with high living standards. So just three examples. It may very well be that China has higher absolute upward mobility than the United States does. But because our living standards are so much higher, that even a lot of the people who experience downward absolute mobility in the United States are still doing a lot better than most of the Chinese people who are experiencing upward absolute mobility. Second example, absolute income mobility was higher in the US for cohorts born 40 years ago than for cohorts born today. But median income is quite a bit higher today than it was for those cohorts, even for many of the people who experienced downward absolute mobility. And then third, absolute income mobility is higher among the poorest Americans than it is among the richest Americans. But none of us would sort of think, gee, I wish I were poor. I wish I had poor parents so that I could have this great absolute upward mobility. I think most of us would prefer having non-poor parents and maybe not getting having as big a chance of getting upward absolute mobility. Second, and this is a point Ambar sort of made in his presentation, all else equal, absolute mobility will be highest when relative mobility is lowest. So if you imagine that you've got a rising tide that makes everybody richer than their parents, if no one is trading places, if everybody occupies the same position that their parents did, everybody experiences upward absolute mobility. If you have the same situation, but you have high relative mobility, so that a lot of kids of poor parents become richer, and a lot of kids of rich parents become poorer, you'll have less upward absolute mobility because some of those rich kids didn't exceed their parents. So I think it's just a complicated measure. I think what we want is broadly distributed increases, either in education or in income, and high relative mobility. And I think the problem with focusing on absolute mobility is it doesn't really allow you to assess whether you've got either of those. So one more example, consider the educational mobility results for rich countries in the report. Rich countries have seen declining absolute upward educational mobility over several cohorts, but the share of people with a tertiary education has been rising over time, and relative mobility has been increasing over time. So to worry about falling absolute mobility obscures the fact that people in rich countries are getting more education, and it's becoming more evenly distributed between kids who grow up rich or poor. Okay, second point is going to be controversial, I think. So the report, so I want to argue that the intergenerational persistence, which is the main relative measure that's in the report, I want to argue that actually summarizes absolute mobility, not relative mobility. The report uses convention in describing it as a measure of relative mobility, but I just think that's wrong. Relative mobility refers to changes in a person's rank when compared to the rank of their parents. If everyone becomes more highly educated than their parents, but nobody changes ranks, there is no relative mobility, even though there's universal upward absolute mobility. A summary measure of relative mobility should tell us how a parent's rank relates to their child's rank. So that's what the rank-rank slope from the Chetty research does. The rank-rank slope is actually also just the Spearman correlation coefficient, rank correlation coefficient. It summarizes the relative mobility that all of the kids experience by indicating how many percentile ranks apart will be kids whose parents were, say, 20 percentiles apart. That's not what the IGP does. The IGP indicates what the absolute gap in educational attainment between kids will be whose parents differed by, say, 2 years of schooling. So the IGP is affected by relative mobility. If people are moving around a lot, then that's going to tend to narrow childhood schooling gaps in adulthood for sure. But it's also affected by changes between the parent and child generations in terms of how dispersed educational attainment is. So if nobody changes places, if everybody occupies the same rank as their parents, but educational attainment becomes more spread out, perhaps because people at the top are getting even more education, then that will indicate worse relative mobility, even though there hasn't been any change in terms of where you rank relative to your parents. So it's really a measure of absolute mobility rather than relative mobility. So the report only looks at relative mobility when it examines these transition matrix sorts of measures. If you start in the bottom, can you make it to the top quartile? Those depend on rank alone, right? If the education distribution increases over time or becomes more spread out, it doesn't matter because you're just looking at people who start in the bottom half and whether they made it to the top quarter. So that's a true relative mobility measure. And this is important because I think while the IGP in the report indicates much more educational mobility in rich countries than in developing ones, the true relative mobility measure is only slightly higher in rich countries. So I think I got that backwards. The IGP indicates, more mobility in rich countries than developing ones, but the actual relative mobility measures that use quartiles, for instance, show only slightly higher, I think. Rich and poor countries look much more similar using the intergenerational correlation, which factors out the increase in inequality that takes place between parent and child generation. So that's getting closer to being a relative mobility measure. But in the end, it's still not a relative mobility measure because it's not using ranks. It's using years of schooling and then standardizing them by standard deviations. Okay, so using the author's data, I found that the probability of someone in the bottom half of the parental education distribution making it to the top half, relative mobility, that was much less strongly related to the parental education Gini than the IGP, this relative mobility measure was. So it really does matter, I think, that we're defining these terms right. Another example, looking at the income mobility literature, is the Great Gatsby curve that some of you have heard about. The United States. So the Great Gatsby curve finds that countries that have more inequality have less mobility, and the United States has a lot of inequality and low relative mobility, if you want to call this intergenerational persistence measure relative. However, the research is indicating that if you use ranks instead of actual incomes, if you look at the relationship between parent income rank and child income rank, the research is showing that actually if you're looking at male earnings, that Americans have just as high mobility as Canada, Sweden, Norway, Germany, perhaps even Denmark. There's a paper by Jim Heckman that's sort of an outlier, but basically finds very similar levels of mobility between those two countries. If you created a Great Gatsby curve and used this rank mobility measure instead of the intergenerational persistence measure, you would get perhaps not any relationship between inequality and mobility, but at any rate, it would be a much a weaker relationship between the two. I think I will stop there and leave enough time for questions. But again, I think the report is incredibly well done and an invaluable resource.
Great, thank you, Scott. Amber, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to Eric and John and Scott. I think Eric and John highlighted the role of skills, so not just focusing on years of schooling, but what actually does lead to skill acquisition that matters for labor markets and mobility, and Scott's rather nerdy point. What are we really measuring? So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond before we turn to Q&A.
Sure. Thanks. And I'll be very brief because I think these are extremely rich set of comments, and I think I agree with most of them, with some probably less than others. But and so just picking up on a few points, I think on the skills questions, yes, I absolutely agree. And I think it's a limitation that we acknowledged very early on in the report. And as both of you mentioned, it's a starting point. I just want to say something a little bit about what can be done. And here's the problem we face. I mean, first of all, we have a WDR on a recent World Development Report, which was about education quality, which I think does an enormously a great job in looking at what is first of all measuring quality across the world and so on, and then looking at the drivers. And it precisely makes this point that it's not enough to send kids to school, and one should perhaps prioritize quality over access. The problem that we have when you're trying to measure mobility is that it's not enough to have data on the average quality of education in a country, because what that's going to do is there's only one factor that you have to apply to everybody in the country, everybody in the data set, regardless of their level of parental education, and forget about one cannot even start thinking about measuring the quality of the parents' education. So even if you just take that out, you'd have to find a way to measure quality of education in a disaggregated manner across individuals in the current generation, let's say, so that you can kind of discount the years of education. That's ideally what you would want to do. Yeah. And if you can't do that, if you instead using a sort of an average measure of quality, what you're going to do is that you're going to find differences across countries, so it's going to be useful for that. But within country, whatever measure you use, it's not going to capture the mobility that you're trying to measure. So that's the challenge we face. One way of addressing that is to take data which is about quality disaggregated by socioeconomic status, which PISA does, for example, and then use that, transport those sort of parameters into a household data set and do something like that. And I think that's not an easy thing to do, and there's going to be methodological problems with that, but I think that's the way to perhaps go about it. I think there was very rightly Eric pointed out that the whole issue with the policy discussion that we have is that it's very difficult. There's really nothing that we can do to establish the causation one way or the other because we have a cross-country data set. So the point of the report was to do essentially two. I mean, first of all, take a close look at the evidence, including from micro-literature and evaluation literature, to come and to see where the evidence is strong. So we're very careful not to say anything about things which have been tried in the name of improving mobility or improving long-term outcomes, like midday meals, like all sorts of programs for which the evidence is actually quite limited, and we actually say that. So instead we focus on things which seem to us meet, to us it seems that they meet the sort of the evidence bar, if you will. And that includes early childhood education and things like that. So there's a deliberate attempt not to say that other things don't matter, and perhaps they do, but just to figure out where is the evidence strong. And this is particularly true in case of the long-term impacts of safety net programs like cash transfers, which the bank obviously has been advocating for in a large number of countries. It just happens that the long-term impacts on learnings and certainly on wages and so on, the jury is still out there. There's not much evidence to show that these actually matter. And which is why we actually downplay them, except to talk about the earned income tax credit in the United States, where there is some evidence showing that there is an impact on outcomes and so on. But I think the point is very well taken, and I think the idea here was about to look to essentially show certain interesting patterns in the data, including with progressive taxation and so on. The evidence is very thin, but just to kind of open the debate out there, and really the research has to happen at a much more sort of disaggregated level, at the level of countries, and maybe using different time series methods and so on. I'll come to and again on John's point on what one can do about and the challenges of actually sort of looking at quality of education in a meaningful way, the data challenge, but also the conceptual challenge of where do you set the threshold. I think this is something that we encountered because we've done some work in measuring inequality of opportunity by, test scores, and it turns out it really matters where you set the threshold. So these are challenges that I think researchers will face in trying to connect not just mobility, but this broader question of dynamic changes in welfare and particularly in learning and so on. On Scott's point, I mean, I think this is where my sort of reading of the literature is that, what in some ways we kind of chose the path of least resistance, and which you can probably detect from the report, which is that when you're trying to measure relative mobility, first of all, there is this sort of a semantic difficulty in defining the phrase relative mobility in a way which is consistent with what you're measuring. Because at the end of the day, what is relative to what? I think that's the sort of problem we face. So what we did was, which we were pretty clear in the report about, is that, okay, we're going to take these measures which are conventional measures, we understand the problems, and then basically see, what do we get from these measures. And Scott, you're very right to point out that some of the relationships that we observe, including the Great Gatsby curve, on which there's quite a bit of controversy because of this concept of what is relative and what is not. And again, I don't think we care much about what is called what, but we take the point that we should perhaps be focusing more on that so-called poverty to privilege rate and the transition matrices and so on. There's always a challenge in the report of trying to find the balance between different measures of the same thing, and we tried to strike that balance, but I think there's plenty of work to be done there. And I would certainly be the first one to be very cautious about interpreting the Great Gatsby curve or any other relationship, cross-country relationship with growth and mobility or inequality and mobility. Also turns out for the Great Gatsby curve, I just want to quote a couple of results here, that when we correlate education inequality with education mobility, it's a very Gatsby type correlation, no matter how you measure it. But it weakens if you go from the regression coefficient to the correlation coefficient to the RAG measure that Scott is talking about. So that tells you something, that more relative something becomes, the relationship seems to get weaker if you believe that you're becoming more relative by making those choices. Interestingly, and I'm just going to leave you with that, but we also find, which to me in a sense is more interesting because it points to some potential causality perhaps, which is that education mobility of a generation measured in terms of correlation or persistence turns out to have, again, a Gatsby-type relationship with inequality in incomes measured roughly at the time when the generation is reaching its peak earning years. So maybe that's useful. I mean, again, it will probably depend on the kind of measure that you use and so on. And we try to make the point that, look, it seems, and there is some theoretical literature to support the idea as well, that there is an inequality trap which is probably being created, which might be captured by the Great Gatsby curve. But again, I would not put too much into just that correlation per se.
Great, thank you, Amber. Fantastic. Just before we turn to the audience, Scott, you've done so much work on mobility in general, especially for the U.S. Are there factors, and this is to all three of you, are there factors that you think did not come out in the report? So I know we talk a lot about family structure and its effect on economic mobility. Scott, your team has done a ton of work on social capital, and you mentioned a lot of that, Amber, in your report. But are there factors that the three of you think could have been covered better in the report, or are not mentioned, which are relevant to the U.S. but are probably maybe not relevant to other countries, and that's why they haven't made it in there? Scott, you want to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think the report did a good job of being honest about how tough a lot of these research questions are to answer, and the fact that we haven't really done it that well for very many of the questions. And so I think it was a good laying out of a variety of things that theory would suggest are going to be important for mobility. And I didn't have big things I would add there. On the policy side, I guess it felt a little bit like a bunch of good mobility promoting things that we can give people without very much on sort of, can we promote people to be doing their own mobility promoting behavior or discouraging them from doing mobility inhibiting behavior. And so I think out of wedlock childbearing, I think is a big one there. in rich countries. I think the design of safety net programs can really impede or support mobility efforts to the extent that they do or don't have perverse incentives around marriage, work, saving, things like that. So that was the only big omission that I think I saw.
Well, I'd just reinforce one of the things that John said about minimum skill levels. If you take the PISA test, which is a test for 15-year-olds around the world, and look at how many cannot accomplish level 1 math problems. Now, a level 1 math problem, you might want to take notes here. A level 1 math problem is that I flew here this morning from California. I paid $800 for my ticket. The exchange rate between the dollar and the euro is 1 to 1.15. How much did my ticket cost in euros? Now, in the US, of 15-year-olds, 23% cannot solve that problem reliably. In Ghana, 91% cannot solve that problem of those that are in school. But if you go to Hong Kong, only 9% cannot solve that problem. And this minimum skill level, obviously, the kids in Ghana cannot compete in an international economy at all. And even if you have more kids in school, there's today 80% of the 15-year-olds are actually in school. The Millennium Development Goals have kicked in, but they're not learning anything. And that I think has to be front and center, particularly if we start moving over to talk about policy issues.
Yeah, as someone who gets involved with lots of things like this, I am a bit allergic to the whataboutism of all the other things you could talk about, because it's so hard to narrow it. Less is usually more in terms of focus, and I think the report did a good job in that. I would say that I think as a corollary, these questions of skill relevance are very tough, and even in, I've spent more time in sub-Saharan Africa looking at these questions than in other regions, and you've seen a place like Uganda, the return had a huge boost, introduced universal primary education, the skill premium return on education changes over time as the labor market equilibrium shifts, and that was 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Now that they're doing universal secondary education, you're going to see another shift. There's the quality factor, but there's also the evolution of the economy. A lot of these places that have the poorest of the poor problems, the extreme poverty, are still agrarian economies. There's big questions around shift from rural to urban, we've gotten pretty good at measuring the service sector economy on a relative basis, but that's usually measuring the problem. It's not measuring what's really going on in these economies. It's just the bits that we know how to measure. And so I think there's a huge amount of questions around it. The advanced economies are grappling with the future of work. The low-income economies are going to confront many parallel questions around that. And so this interface between skills, standards, and the dynamics of each economy, and even the urban-rural linkages, will be very fundamental. And so I think this is, again, why I have in mind that this type of resource created by this database can be so helpful for deeper dives on that. Because whenever you hear, oh, Africa needs X, be skeptical, because there are so many diverse contexts in that region, for example, and similarly across Asia. So, and everywhere else in the world. Every state in this country has very different particular issues in every geography. So I just feel like the more we can be, it's not to let complexity dominate, but the more we can be nuanced in appreciating the complexity of this, in thinking about these very frontier questions, the better off our debates can be.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to turn over to the audience. Can you wait for the mic and please introduce yourself?
Carlos Savillon from the Central American Bank of Economic Integration. This study seems like a study that goes with that idea that education is very important for progress. It's an idea that's very generally embraced by groups from the left or the right. And Professor Hanishek was correctly pointing out that causality linkage is hard to find. But the argument you were making about Ghanaians and Hong Kongese, even if we go on the quality level, it doesn't correlate. For example, Hong Kong in the 1950s, when the quantity and quality of the education of the Hong Kongese was a fraction of the last 10 years, had a rate of economic growth of 12% annually. In the last 10 years, they just grew by 3% annually. We can't find correlations, especially if we go back in time, let's say the late 19th century for the U.S. What perhaps 1% of the U.S. population, 25 or older, had a university degree. And obviously the quality of that education was much lower than the Americans of today. But today we got almost, 45% of the U.S. population, 25 or older, with a college degree. And yet back then, even though the rates are hard to be, it's not easy to come by precise rate for the late 19th century, but everything suggests that the economy had its spectacular rate of growth, perhaps 8% annually. And in the last 10 years, with this impressively well-educated American population, the economy grew by just by 2% annually. So there's no correlation in quantity or in quality. In any country in the world, I can't find it. I did a postdoctorate in economic history. I looked at a lot of nations. I couldn't find any. However, I found an interesting correlation going from the level of education in quantity and quality of the head of state and the rate of economic growth. This was an interesting phenomenon because you could have governments with nations with very low educational level, but if the head of state was highly educated, then it correlated. Let's say, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa. This is a region that, if you look at the last 50 years, has been governed extremely nepotistic, tribalistic way. And their heads of states have had low education, and rates of growth have been terrible. But if you look at East Asia, the rates of economic growth has been much better in levels of education. Just look at China right now. It's number one and number two got a PhD. I found throughout history this correlation. The head of state was fundamental. Quantity and quality of its education, numbers of years. And what I measured was the universities from which they obtained their degrees. And it correlates impressively, well, not 100%, but very well. So
Okay,
I was wondering if the World Bank has gone in this direction to look at the correlation between the educational level of the heads of states and rates of economic growth.
Well,
Have
I disagree that there's no correlation between quality of education and growth. That's what I thought the picture I showed you was. It's an obvious, pretty clear correlation. Now, if you look back in history and you look at agricultural times, quality of the land probably was more important than quality of education. But as you move into manufacturing and into sort of more ideas-based societies, quality of education is going to be the determinant. And that's going to be true for undeveloped or developing countries of today as they try to develop. The only way they're going to develop is to, in fact, move up in terms of their production.
That's right. Okay, second question.
Tom Timberg, consultant. Obviously, it was a marvelous panel and particularly very nicely integrated in terms of things. But I feel a little bit like the person who writes the book review and says about the book you didn't write, and perhaps it's in your report. But I note that you did not weight by population all of your correlations. Now, since a few countries, India, China, the European Union, possibly Russia, etc., tend to dominate the world. I wonder if there might not have been some use in trying that weighting. And that also leads to another point in your policy recommendations down about 7 or 8. You talked about localized economic development involvements. The database which you're building on, which is one of the, as far as I'm concerned, great gifts of the World Bank to the world, also actually has, or the people who do it have, subnational data from countries like China and India and the United States that have such variation. And every study indicates that, like retail, like restaurants, it's location, location, location. If you have the good, the advantage of being in one of the Washington suburban suburbs, perhaps you get relatively high quality education, maybe. And if you have the misfortune to be somewhere in the hills of the Appalachians, perhaps you don't. I wonder if you might not think about trying, you talked about other kinds of disaggregation, but thinking about subnational disaggregation using that data. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for these comments, because it gives me the opportunity to very quickly talk about what I didn't have time to talk about. First of all, we did do the estimates with population weighted, of course. China dominates, India dominates, which means developing world actually does worse, because those countries are not doing well on relative mobility, relative the way we define it. But it's a slightly different picture with absolute mobility. So, and we actually, when you do that, you can, which we did, which will be a blog. It's not in the book. We can, of course, measure mobility for the entire world. So for the representative individual of the world, and it actually looks pretty much similar to what the developing world looks. Okay, a little bit better, because the European Union and so on, and even the United States have done better than the developing world. So it does a little bit better, but there is no, sort of a big change in the overall historical sort of picture. On the sort of the localized intervention. So one of the slides that I had, which I just want to talk about very briefly, is that so we tried to mimic something that has been done for the United States and Canada, which is to look at the correlation between intergenerational mobility, in our case education, and what we call geographic segregation. Segregation is a loaded term, so I would rather use the word geographic concentration of educated people in the country. So it's a simple measure of geographic concentration, which basically means to what extent are educated people in the country concentrated within certain primary sampling units. Higher that number, higher is the level of concentration or segregation, whichever way you want to call it. And it turns out that across countries, there's a strong correlation between that and intergenerational mobility. Within countries, talking about the subnational data, we've actually done it for 6 large developing countries: China, Nigeria, Egypt, India, Indonesia, I'm forgetting the 6th one, Brazil. Yeah, we find the same pattern. So within countries, provinces or states which are more mobile also have a lower level of concentration by educated population. We're very cautious to draw policy conclusions out of it. All it tells us is that if you have a higher degree of spatial inequality, you tend to be less mobile in terms of, or there tends to be more persistence, so which means less mobility by some measure. Which is similar to what people have found for the United States and even for Canada. And the argument that they have made is that this essentially tells you that localized policies matter, which could be social capital. We know from Chetty's work and others that neighborhood, social environment, neighborhood infrastructure, but he makes a big point about social capital at the neighborhood level, including the peer effect and mentoring. I mean, all these things come in. It's impossible to establish unless we do very detailed research at the level of countries, which would be the next step, and I hope some of my colleagues will actually use this data set, but also collect more data to look at these questions country by country. But the overall pattern seems to suggest there's something there. There's something about spatial inequality and the mobility that you observe. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What was found about the content of the education, such as science, technology, engineering, and math?
Did you do any disaggregation by
Uh,
field?
No, we did
No.
not. We basically had data on years of education, and even that was it was a difficult job because the surveys don't measure education attainment the same way, and countries differ a lot in terms of what is even defined as primary and secondary and so on. So we didn't do that. But we did. There are other pieces of work which we refer to here very briefly, which is about we look at inequality of opportunity in terms of meeting certain standards in math and science in particular, and there are some correlations between that and mobility, but it's not something that we've looked at carefully at all. But I mean, it's a good point, and I think that's something that should be looked at.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here on such a wet morning, and please join me in thanking our panelists as well.